Grab a cup of coffee and start your day with Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life features stories to inspire, motivate, and empower you. Live your best life now. Listen, learn, think, and decide. Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. Visit cyacyl.com.
Welcome to Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. I'm Joan Herman. Thanks for tuning in. In the peak of the U.S. space age, American astronauts were launched on death-defying missions that fascinated the world. The media focused on the brave smiles of their young wives who were transformed into American royalty. They had tea with Jackie Kennedy, appeared on the cover of Life magazine, and quickly grew into fashion icons. As their celebrity rose, and as divorce and tragic death began to touch their lives, they rallied together and formed a bond that has lasted for more than 50 years. Today's guest, Lilly Koppel, author of the book, The Astronaut Wives Club, is here to tell the real story of the women who stood behind some of the biggest heroes in American history. In addition to the Astronaut Wives Club, Lilly is the best-selling author of The Red Leather Diary. She's written for the New York Times Magazine, Huffington Post, and Glamour. Welcome, Lilly. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Lilly, when I first saw your book, it brought back such wonderful memories of being in grammar school, and we were all gathered around a television watching the space launch and being mesmerized by it all. And I can recall seeing the pictures of the women that we're about to talk about. And to young girls like myself, they really were celebrities. So what made you write this book? What began your interest in these women, and what inspired you?
Well, I'm someone who's fascinated with women's stories, and one-of-a-kind, never-before-been-told ones. And like most good stories, I stumbled upon it by chance. I was at home one Saturday, sort of relaxing, just trying to clear my head. I was working on a novel, actually, at the time, which I quickly abandoned when I found out about the Astronaut Wives, as they were called. But I was looking through a photo book of the moon landings, and there were images that are familiar to all of us, the lunar surface, Neil Armstrong planting a flag in the moon, Buzz Aldrin in his spacesuit, and I turned a page and all of a sudden was met by these women, and they were in their pastel mini dresses, and they had these skyrocketing beehives, and it was like a light went off, and I turned to my husband, who's a big fan of the right stuff, and I just said, has anything ever been done on these women exclusively? And he said, I don't think so, but that would be an incredible story. And I started learning about these wives, that they were in the Astronaut Wives Club starting in the early 60s, where they got together for coffee and tea and cocktails and just to share a cigarette or a smile or tears about what their husband was doing, which is riding rockets for a day job. I learned that they raised their families in the so-called space burbs outside of NASA's operations in Houston, that was also known as Togethersville at the time, and that they were part of this absolutely exclusive group of women whose husbands had went where few men have ever gone. After all, only 12 men walked on the moon. And I started calling them up and visiting them across the country, and came to them really as a writer, but also as a woman and as a friend, as someone who saw a tremendous amount of value in their stories and saw this as a slice of American history that the public really should know more about.
These were women that one day they were young wives, young military wives, and then the next day, almost overnight, they were thrust into this stardom. Were any of them prepared for what followed?
Not really. I mean, they were like America's first reality stars, and we're going back to 1959. This is 2 years after Sputnik launched, and America is scrambling to keep up with the Soviets and hopefully beat them in the mission to get man into space. And once their husbands were announced, the Mercury 7 astronauts, who are original astronauts, their young wives went from living in the shadows to being presented in the spotlight. As one of them told me, Reen Carpenter, who was blonde and vivacious and witty, she said it was as if I was living on a dark stage and suddenly somebody turns on the spotlight. And you have Life magazine that comes in and buys access to their stories and their lives for $500,000 in 1959. So from being military wives, married to test pilots, which was a pretty grim life. Your husband was flying all of the time. You were worried if he didn't come home by 6 o'clock, you might be a widow. And all of a sudden, the whole world is looking to you as sort of the model American housewife. And with not much support from NASA and with no training for this public role, these 7 incredible women, and later the others who had joined their ranks once we went to the moon, really pulled off the job with flying colors.
Lily, who were some of the women that we're talking about?
When we're talking about the Mercury 7 astronauts, who are the original group of Astro Wives, as the country called them, we're talking about Annie Glenn. She was really the ultimate astronaut wife, married to John Glenn, who was the first astronaut to orbit the Earth. Annie and John met as toddlers in a playpen in New Concord, Ohio, and they were really seen as the all-American couple. And Life magazine gave Annie the lead in the first cover story about the wives. She really had that sort of squeaky clean image that NASA and America wanted from its astronaut and wives, although there was often much more going on behind the scenes with the other families. But the rest of the astronaut families sort of felt like it wasn't about keeping up with the Joneses. It was about keeping up with the Glenns, I think. Though Annie had her own challenges. She had a stutter, so it made it all the more challenging for her to be in this very public role that John's new job required of her. There was Reen Carpenter, who I mentioned, who was blonde and beautiful, and JFK said he found her the most attractive of the astronaut wives. And she's pretty special because she would go on to write her own newspaper column and really was an early example of a liberated woman in what could be seen from the outside as a somewhat more conservative group. She ended up hosting a talk show in Washington where she was almost like an early Oprah. There's also Betty Grissom, who is sort of the less sophisticated wife among the group, but always just sort of said it like it was. She and her astronaut Gus met in Indiana, and the rest of the wives sort of saw her as more of a country mouse, less sophisticated, and for their first cover shoot for Life, teased her because she didn't want to get her hair done. She didn't want to get her makeup done. But Betty just has a lot of heart and worked very hard to put Gus through engineering school and would joke about her PhD degree, which was putting hubby through. And Gus once gave her a big compliment that she remembers to this day when he told her, you're really the astronaut in this family.
Now, you mentioned Reen Carpenter having a career. Were any of these other women career women, or were they all basically, standing behind their husbands? And if they weren't, did any of them express regret to you?
Well, it's interesting because, I'm from a different generation from the wives. I'm 32. When I set out to write this story, one of the wives looked at me, Jo Shura, who's married to astronaut Wally Shura, and she said, where were you during the moon landing? And I said, Joe, I think I was moon dust, and we shared quite a laugh over that. What I did promise all of them was that I had the energy and stamina to travel around the country and to really research this topic better than it's ever been done before and put myself back in their shoes. And, I really am their age when they were going through all of these exhilarating and terrifying moments. But, they had to impress upon me that this was such a different world, that they were mothers and wives first, that they were devoted to their husbands' careers. As Reen Carpenter said, we were career military wives with eyes glued to our husbands' careers. Entertaining machines was how she put it. Though what I felt was very compelling about this story is although we see the wives sort of start out in that perfect model, almost Stepford 1950s wife mold, by the end of the 60s, once we've landed on the moon, we also see the emergence of the modern woman, or the launch of the modern woman, if you will. And we go through a lot with these ladies. One turns to alcohol because she can't take the pressure. Another will eventually commit suicide years after her husband dies in the Apollo 1 tragedy. And many of the space marriages also fell apart after the men came back from the moon. So we see the women's bravery emerge, and their resilience, and sometimes just their human frailty in all sorts of surprising ways.
Well, Lily, I think that's a wonderful place for us to pause and take a break. So we're going to take a break for this week's Good Life Tips. Stay with us for information to help you make the positive life changes that we talk about on the show. When I return, I will continue my discussion with Lilly Koppel. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. I'm Joan Herman. Our guest today is Lilly Koppel, author of the book, The Astronaut Wives Club. Lily, before break, we were talking about some of the difficult times that these women endured. What can we learn from the strength that these women displayed during those difficult times?
Well, let's go back to the beginning, when they're just forming, when they're just figuring out this is a brave new world. The country's caught up in space fever. We're going to go to the moon. And what does it even mean to be an astronaut wife? And NASA, like I mentioned, didn't give the women a whole lot of training. They were sort of thrust into the spotlight, and they had to fend for themselves. Now, they are married to the most competitive guys on the face of the earth. These are alpha dogs. They compete in everything from handball to who does the most jogging laps around the space burbs in the morning, to water skiing. And of course, the big race is who's going to get into space first and who's going to land those coveted moon missions. And the women just looked at each other and they said, if we're going to survive in this new cutthroat NASA world, we really have to rely on each other. Although the competition did get to them in some cases, as is only human, they really did do that, and they formed this sisterhood. They were like space sisters, and they lived next to each other near NASA, and they helped raise each other's children, and they would run across a lawn in an instant, at a phone call if they needed to support their friends, cook dinner, have a shoulder to cry on, and deal with some pretty big losses, because we did lose 8 astronauts on the path to the moon. But there are also incredibly bright sides as well to this story. One of the rituals that the wives had to deal with was the post-flight press conference. And every time your husband went up on a mission, the wife of the hour, all of the women in the neighborhood would gather at her house. They would bring deviled eggs and moon cake, which would be a cake that was decorated to look like the lunar surface, casseroles, cocktails, cigarettes, you name it. And after your husband went up, you were expected to come out on your lawn and greet the press. Well, the press was hungry to know what the wife was experiencing. And it was pretty morbid. It was like, are you worried he's not going to make it back? Well, of course she was worried, but there was no way she could really express her fears to the country, because NASA wanted her to make everything bright and happy, and so the pressure was on. So one of the early wives, Reen Carpenter, came up with a motto for the group, and she just said, if you can't think of anything else to say, just say you're happy, proud, and thrilled. And this would sort of become the wives' motto throughout the space race. And more than just being sort of a catchy phrase, happy, proud, and thrilled, it's like it's keep calm and carry on, 1960s style. Mm-hmm. It really spoke to the incredible bravery and strength of these women to keep everything appearing cool, calm, and collected down on Earth when emotions were just raging within them.
We're talking about the astronaut program and astronaut wives, but these are lessons that people can incorporate into their lives on any level. Just the importance of friendship and communal support getting through difficult times. these women are a wonderful example of surviving competition, which we all face every day, or getting through crisis and tragedy and transition and leaning on people around you. So I think it's a great reminder, the story that you're sharing.
Absolutely. And just acknowledging all of our individual differences as well. One of my favorite missions is Apollo 8, and this was America's first mission to orbit the moon, the first time humans orbited the moon. And it brings two wives into focus, and it takes place over Christmas 1968. It's very dramatic. The astronauts read from the book of Genesis as they're going around the moon before they disappear around the so-called dark side. And two of the women back on Earth, the mission wives, are Marilyn Lovell, who your audience may already recognize from Apollo 13. Her husband, Jim Lovell, is played by Tom Hanks. Marilyn was someone who is sort of an eternal optimist to this day, a glass half full gal, and she said she would never allow herself to even think of the possibility that on one of these very dangerous missions, Jim wouldn't come back, even when she was facing the most dire headlines during Apollo 13 later on. But another wife on Apollo 8 was Susan Borman, and she was one of Marilyn's good friends as well. But the pressure really got to her, and I think we can all understand that. Before the crew went up, she was told by NASA that it had a 50-50 chance of whether or not it would make it back to Earth or not. And sitting at home in Houston in the space burbs, she really believed that her husband, Frank, was going to die orbiting the moon, so much that she began to write his eulogy while he was up there. And she had a difficult time with things. She sort of turned to alcohol and eventually became an alcoholic, but later went to rehab. And this dark secret was something that she couldn't even share with, her closest friends, the rest of the astronaut wives at the time.
The book is The Astronaut Wives Club by Lilly Koppel. Lilly, if our listeners would like to get more information about you and your work, where can they go?
They can visit my website, which is astronautwivesclub.com.
And as always, our listeners can visit our website, cyacyl.com. That stands for Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. While on our site, listen to past shows as podcasts, read the digital magazine, sign up for our mailing list, take part in the book club, and be sure to follow the show on Facebook and Twitter. Lilly, in our remaining moments, what do you think would be a really important lesson that you would like our listeners to walk away with?
What really impacted me was just the value of these women's experiences. I mean, they went through all of this back in the 60s, and so for 50 years now, they've been getting together. They still have reunions. They meet for cruises. In fact, the women have remained closer than the astronauts. But somehow their quiet bravery back at home was sort of glossed over until now. And I think it's just a really important reminder that it's not just the hero that makes the hero, that sometimes it's the woman waiting back at home as well. And as many of the astronauts have said, they're so pleased that the women's story has finally come to light. And they've told me, just that we may not have landed on the moon if it wasn't for these quiet heroes in the background, sort of keeping the home fires burning bright.
Lilly, thank you for spending time with us today. Thank you for sharing stories of some very strong, incredible women that can be role models for all of us, and for bringing back some very fond memories, and for reminding us about the power of friendship, the importance of supporting and loving and being there for each other. So thank you, and I wish you the best of luck with your book.
Thank you so much.
This is Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. I'm Joan Herman. Thanks for tuning in.